Hellblade 2 is probably the most beautiful game ever made. Like, my god, some of the scenes here, the lighting, the environmental detail, it all works together to occasionally trick me into thinking I'm watching a live-action Senua stroll through these gorgeous Nordic landscapes. For a moment, I'm lost in it, in awe of Ninja Theory and their craftsmanship. That is, until I start to notice that the only input I've given the game in the last 5 minutes is the walk forward button, while I'm bombarded with more exposition than Hellblade 1 had proffered up in its entirety. And all the while, Senua's head is ringing with voices, more and more voices. Not just the Furies and Druth, but also her father, her mother, the bodies of the dead all around her, all telling me that Senua should feel guilty.
You let him die. You let him die like this.
Let her die. Look at them, Senua. The faces of the ones you failed.
Guilty for letting these slaves that have no name or real connection to Senua die from a completely random act of God. That guilt keeps getting bashed into her and my head. Guilt that was once focused on her own experiences in her family and community. A pivotal part of her personal journey, now inflated to the entire region she's from. Senua, now apparently supposed to be the Scottish version of Moses leading his people out of Egypt. As a huge fan of the first Hellblade, I could tell almost immediately that there was something missing from this big-budget sequel. After 7 years and hundreds of millions of dollars, this is the best they could come up with? I just don't get it. The first Hellblade was made on a microscopic budget compared to its ambitions. The gameplay and puzzles were somewhat shallow and didn't require a whole lot of skill or outside-the-box thinking, but they worked well enough as the connective tissue between the story beats that really made that game special. Senua's story was told with subtlety, restraint, and creativity, showing and not telling, letting the audience decide exactly what is happening in Senua's mind along with her, and uncovering her past bit by bit. Every moment of that game had narrative motivation, as Senua delved deeper and deeper into hell to save the soul of her lover Dillion, and finally, absolve herself of the guilt she had harbored for being the sole survivor of a massacre on her village, and the shame of having mental illness in a time where that was perceived as a sign of evil. In Hellblade 2, Senua is, she's pretending to be a slave so she can find out where the slavers live so that she can kill them all for revenge. But then everyone dies in a storm and she feels really guilty about it for some reason. But then she meets the slave boss guy and turns out he's hot, so she begins her femdom arc.
How does it feel to be the one bound and helpless?
And they discover that some evil zombies are killing everybody.
The settlement has fallen to the Troika. Troika.
And that triggers Senua into having to deal with the exact same trauma she already worked through in the last game, and this is all starting to sound a little bit contrived, isn't it? At times, it feels like the game is almost mocking me, shouting at me in a dozen different voices while making me crawl through a ditch pressing A to push fucking boxes out of the way. I'm sure Ninja Theory thought I would be very impressed by all this, but really I'm just sitting here like, it just feels so unearned. Like the writers know that there isn't as much substance here, so they have to max out the drama and force the emotions of these moments. Ninja Theory also made some pretty odd choices with the lore of Hellblade. The first game was pretty much entirely non-committal in terms of whether the game you were playing was supposed to be real, conjured up in Senua's head, or a mix of the two. Like the spinning top at the end of Inception, this choice allowed the audience to debate and decide for themselves what all these things could possibly symbolize. Hellblade 2 decides that this non-committal attitude isn't going to work for a sequel, and makes it very clear that pretty much everything you're seeing in the game, and the last game, is completely real and factual. It turns out that Senua doesn't have quite the active imagination we all thought, and basically the only thing happening solely in her head is the voices she hears. As if that wasn't bad enough, while the game feeds you this story that's oddly paced and lacking in nuance, it asks you to engage with it in a way that's almost identical mechanically to Hellblade 1. 7 whole years to make this game, and they didn't iterate on their gameplay mechanics a single fucking bit. Light attack, heavy attack, dodge, parry. Line up the symbols to unlock a door. Walk forward. Surprise! QuickTime event! Those are the ways that Hellblade 2 asks you to engage with it. No more and no less. When Hellblade 1 came out, the reaction to it was pretty much universal. The consensus was that the story was great, the game looked and sounded good, but the gameplay was relatively shallow and repetitive. Everyone agreed on this, and it was well understood by the community that any sequel to Hellblade should spend a good amount of time working on those gameplay systems. And yet Ninja Theory has seemingly decided that their formula needs no iteration, no additional depth or complexity. The combat is the same, the puzzles are the same. The problem, though, is that you can only get away with shallow gameplay if the story is so amazing that nothing else really matters. I can see the comments already. People saying, the gameplay isn't the point, Hellblade is all about the story. And yeah, I agree. Hellblade 1 had an incredible and thought-provoking story that didn't really need super engaging gameplay to prop it up. What there was enough. That just isn't the case for Hellblade 2. The story is messier, less focused, and less interesting than Hellblade 1, while the gameplay is essentially the same. But even if the story was just as good as Hellblade 1, that still doesn't really excuse the lack of creativity and innovation in the gameplay here, does it? They had 7 fucking years to come up with something more interesting and dynamic than this, and they chose not to. I don't even know what should have been added here to make it better. Maybe items or abilities? Different weapon types with different movesets? Environmental puzzles that contribute more towards world building? I don't know, I'm not the game dev here. I just know that they could have done more with the framework they have. 7 years, man. What were they doing in all that time? I mean, yeah, the game looks great. So does every other Unreal 5 engine-based game. An engine which basically does all the dev work for you. Did it take that long to set up the ears? I'd really love to see a no-clip documentary on this game or something, because it just doesn't make sense to me. Okay. I think that maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh here. Hellblade 2 isn't a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. There's an incredible level of craftsmanship on display here. The programmers, artists, voice and mocap actors, and yes, even the writers, deserve credit for what they've created. The combat may not be much different, but it's certainly more fluid and exciting than Hellblade 1. The animation work is second to none. The spatial audio is completely engrossing. And the story, although not quite as good as its predecessor, is still plenty engaging and should be commended for trying some new things, like featuring multiple other characters. But I don't know, I just expected more. Not more in terms of length, I'm totally fine with short games, but more depth and complexity, both in the gameplay and the narrative. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more gamer rage, and please consider subscribing to my Patreon to support high quality rants like this. See you on the next one.